In the closing decades of the 19th century, when the United States was racing forward on rails of steel and rivers of capital, a singular idea began to take shape in the mind of George Washington Vanderbilt II. Unlike the industrial titans of his family, he was not driven by factories or finance, but by books, art, landscape, and an almost aristocratic longing for permanence. At a moment when American wealth was young, loud, and impatient, George Vanderbilt dreamed of something older, quieter, and infinitely more demanding, an estate that would outlast him, outshine his era, and insulate its owner from the accelerating noise of modern life. That dream would become Biltmore Estate, the largest privately owned home ever built in the United States, and the beginning of a legacy whose cost would be counted not only in money, but in generations. The choice of location was deliberate and symbolic. In the rolling Blue Ridge Mountains near Asheville, Vanderbilt saw a landscape that echoed the European countryside he admired, distant from the soot of New York and the scrutiny of society. What he purchased was not simply land, but scale, over 100,000 acres at its peak. An empire of forest and field, designed to be controlled, cultivated, and civilized. From the beginning, the project defied American norms. This was not a summer house, nor a country retreat in the casual sense. It was conceived as a self-sustaining domain, complete with farms, villages, and an architectural centerpiece that would rival the great chateaux of France. Even before the first stone was laid, the estate demanded obedience from time, labor, and money on a scale few could comprehend. To give form to his vision, Vanderbilt turned to Richard Morris Hunt, the most celebrated architect of America's Gilded Age. Hunt, trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, understood that this commission was not merely about shelter or prestige, it was about cultural translation. Together, patron and architect selected the French Renaissance style, inspired by the chateaux of the Loire Valley, as a statement of lineage rather than nationality, a declaration that American wealth no longer needed to apologize for its youth. The design that emerged was monumental. A limestone facade rising with deliberate symmetry, crowned by towers and dormers, anchored by a central hall meant to overwhelm the visitor into silence. Every line of the building asserted control, order, and endurance. Construction began in 1889, and almost immediately, the project escaped conventional accounting. Thousands of workers were brought into the mountains, many of them immigrants, laboring under harsh conditions to reshape terrain that resisted every attempt at mastery. Roads had to be cut where none existed. A private railway spur was built to deliver materials. Indiana limestone was hauled across states. European artisans were imported to carve stone, lay parquet floors, and install hand-painted ceilings. Nothing about the process was efficient, and efficiency was never the goal. What mattered was fidelity to an ideal that demanded constant revision, escalation, and expense. As the walls rose, so too did the costs, spiraling quietly beyond any realistic measure of return. Inside, the estate grew into a labyrinth of excess masked as refinement. The main house would eventually contain 250 rooms, including 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, a library of over 10,000 volumes, an indoor swimming pool, and a private bowling alley. Each space required heat, light, water, and staff. Behind every visible luxury stood an invisible system of labor maids, cooks, gardeners, engineers, and managers, all necessary to keep the house alive. Biltmore was not a static object. It was an organism that consumed resources daily, relentlessly. The grandeur visitors admired was inseparable from a permanent operational burden that could never be paused, never be reduced without diminishing the whole. The landscape surrounding the house was no less ambitious. Vanderbilt enlisted Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, to transform depleted farmland into a controlled pastoral vision. Olmsted approached the project scientifically, introducing managed forestry at a scale unprecedented in America. While this would later be praised as visionary conservation, it was also enormously expensive, slow to yield results, and dependent on Vanderbilt's personal fortune. Fields were replanted, forests regenerated, villages planned for workers, all reinforcing the idea that Biltmore was not merely a home, but an experiment in total environment. Yet experiments, especially those driven by idealism rather than profit, carry risks that compound quietly over time. When the house was finally opened on Christmas Eve, in 1895, it was immediately recognized as something America had never seen before. Newspapers marveled at its size, its technology, its unapologetic extravagance. Guests moved through its halls as if through a museum, aware that they were witnessing a peak moment in the display of private wealth. But beneath the admiration lay an unspoken truth: Biltmore was finished only in appearance. In reality, it would never be complete. Maintenance, upgrades, staffing, and land management ensured that the estate remained in a permanent state of becoming and of spending. The house did not simply exist in time, it resisted time, and resistance always carries a price. For George Vanderbilt, the cost was initially abstract. His inheritance seemed inexhaustible, drawn from a family fortune built on railroads and shipping. Yet unlike other members of the Vanderbilt family, George did not replenish that fortune through aggressive business expansion. He consumed it instead, converting liquid capital into stone, wood, and landscape. Biltmore transformed wealth into permanence. But in doing so, it stripped that wealth of flexibility. What could once adapt to markets and crises became fixed, immovable, and demanding. The estate stood as a triumph of vision, and the beginning of a financial gravity that would pull downward on every generation that followed. By the dawn of the 20th century, the warning signs were subtle but present. Operating costs rose steadily. Agricultural experiments failed to produce expected returns. Taxes increased. The American economy itself was changing, becoming less tolerant of idle aristocratic wealth. Biltmore, designed as a refuge from modernity, was quietly becoming vulnerable to it. The very qualities that made the estate extraordinary, its size, complexity, and ambition, ensured that it could never be easily adapted to a world that no longer measured success by monuments alone. This was the paradox at the heart of Biltmore Estate. It was built to defeat impermanence. Yet it locked its creators into a battle they could never conclusively win. The house would endure, but the family behind it would feel the strain. What began as a personal sanctuary was already evolving into a burden of scale, one that demanded sacrifices invisible to the public eye. And as the 20th century approached with its wars, taxes, and economic shocks, the question was no longer whether Biltmore could be built, but whether it could be kept, to be continued. At the turn of the 20th century, Biltmore stood complete in form, yet unfinished in consequence. The house had achieved what George Vanderbilt intended. It commanded awe, silence, and reverence from those who crossed its threshold. But beyond the ceremonial spaces and carefully staged harmony of stone and landscape, the estate had begun to assert a quieter authority, one that governed the daily rhythms of money, labor, and obligation. Unlike financial assets that could be sold, restructured, or diversified, Biltmore demanded continuity. It required the same level of attention on an ordinary winter morning as it did during moments of celebration. The house did not scale down with time, it only accumulated need. George Vanderbilt's personal life offered no relief from this pressure. In 1898, he married Edith Vanderbilt, a union that brought companionship and stability, but also reinforced the expectation that Biltmore was no longer a private experiment. It had become a family institution. Edith embraced the role with seriousness and intelligence, overseeing operations, engaging with the workers' communities on the estate, and attempting to balance the idealism of her husband's vision with the realities of cost. Yet even her discipline could not change the underlying equation. The estate's expenses were structural, not managerial. No amount of efficiency could shrink the scale that had been deliberately built into its foundations. As the years passed, George Vanderbilt's health declined. He died in 1914 at the age of 51, leaving behind not only his wife and young daughter, but a property whose financial gravity immediately intensified. Ownership transferred, but responsibility did not diminish. Edith Vanderbilt inherited Biltmore at the exact moment when America itself was entering a new phase of uncertainty. The country was no longer intoxicated by unrestrained expansion. Progressive reform, scrutiny of wealth, and shifting public attitudes toward inherited fortunes were reshaping the social landscape. For estates like Biltmore, these changes would prove decisive. One of the most profound shifts came through taxation. The introduction of federal income tax and expanded estate taxes transformed the relationship between wealth and property. Biltmore, once a symbol of unchallenged private capital, now existed within a framework that demanded regular, quantifiable contributions to the state. The estate's vast acreage and monumental structure translated directly into rising tax obligations. What had been an expression of freedom from urban and governmental constraints now tied the family more tightly to them. The house that promised independence began to behave like a liability ledger that never closed. At the same time, the estate's internal economy strained under modern conditions. The number of workers required to operate Biltmore remained high, even as labor expectations evolved. Servants demanded fairer wages and improved living conditions. Agricultural yields fluctuated unpredictably. The managed forests, though forward-thinking, did not produce immediate financial relief. Every attempt to modernize the estate revealed a paradox: adaptation required investment, and investment deepened dependence on a structure already too large to sustain itself easily. The outbreak of the First World War accelerated these pressures. While Biltmore itself remained physically untouched by conflict, the economic reverberations were unavoidable. Supply chains shifted, costs rose, and social priorities hardened. Extravagance, once admired, became increasingly uncomfortable to defend. Large private households appeared out of step with a nation mobilizing resources for war. Edith Vanderbilt responded pragmatically, opening parts of the estate to support agricultural production and community efforts. But the symbolic weight of Biltmore, as a relic of excess, could not be fully softened. The house had been built to transcend time, yet history had begun to press against its walls. Within the broader Vanderbilt family, contrasts grew sharper. Other branches, enriched by the industrial success of figures like Cornelius Vanderbilt East II, still commanded immense resources, but even those fortunes were fragmenting under division and taxation. Biltmore, unlike diversified investments or urban real estate, could not be broken apart without destroying its essence. It was indivisible. To keep it whole was expensive. To dismantle it would betray the very purpose of its creation. The family faced a choice that was not truly a choice at all. By the 1920s, the estate's financial strain had become unmistakable. Portions of land were sold, reducing the original acreage significantly. These sales were framed as rational adjustments, but each transaction marked a quiet retreat from the original vision of total domain. What had once been an empire of land was now being pared back to sustain the house at its center. The logic was cruelly circular: land was sold to support the building. Yet the building's existence had required that land in the first place. Edith Vanderbilt navigated this era with resolve, but also with the awareness that the inheritance she managed was less a gift than a custodial burden. Her task was not to expand or elevate the estate, but simply to keep it alive. Maintenance replaced ambition. Preservation replaced creation. Biltmore had entered a new phase of existence, one defined not by aspiration, but by endurance. The estate no longer looked toward the future with confidence. It watched it approach with caution. What emerged during this period was a quiet truth about monuments built on personal wealth. They do not age like people, nor do they evolve like businesses. They persist, unchanged in scale, demanding loyalty from those who follow. For the Vanderbilt family, Biltmore became a fixed point around which every financial decision revolved. It absorbed attention, capital, and emotional energy. The house remained magnificent, but its magnificence had become inseparable from anxiety. As the world moved toward the economic shocks that would define the next decade, Biltmore stood poised on a fragile threshold. It had survived its creator. It had adapted, imperfectly, to a changing nation. But survival was not security. The estate had been built for an era that no longer existed, and the cost of maintaining that illusion was about to rise dramatically. The question that haunted the family was no longer whether Biltmore could endure history, but whether history would allow the family to endure Biltmore. To be continued. By the time the 1930s arrived, the world surrounding Biltmore had shifted so completely that the estate itself seemed to belong to another civilization. The optimism that once insulated monumental wealth had eroded, replaced by uncertainty, austerity, and a growing public skepticism toward inherited privilege. When the Great Depression tightened its grip on the American economy, Biltmore did not merely feel the downturn, it amplified it. The estate's fixed costs, once absorbed quietly by a vast fortune, now stood exposed, rigid, and unforgiving. Heating a mansion of this scale, maintaining its roofs and stonework, paying its staff, and settling its taxes required a steady flow of capital that no longer existed in abundance. What had once been an expression of cultural confidence now functioned like a financial engine running without fuel. For Edith Vanderbilt, the Depression was not an abstract economic event, but a daily reckoning. Revenues from remaining agricultural operations declined sharply. Investments outside the estate faltered. Public pressure mounted against conspicuous displays of wealth, and private estates across the country shuttered rooms, dismissed staff, or were abandoned entirely. Biltmore, however, could not simply be closed. Stone does not pause its decay, and empty halls deteriorate faster than occupied ones. The house demanded heat in winter, ventilation in summer, and constant oversight, regardless of how many people walked its corridors. The cost of doing nothing proved nearly as high as the cost of doing everything. At the same time, the surrounding region faced its own crisis. Asheville, once buoyed by tourism and development, collapsed under the weight of municipal debt. Businesses failed. Construction halted. Unemployment surged. Against this backdrop, Biltmore's continued operation became both a source of resentment and a fragile economic lifeline. Hundreds of local residents still depended on the estate for work, tying the Vanderbilt family's decisions to the survival of an entire community. The estate was no longer a private matter. It had become a regional actor, its fate intertwined with forces far beyond the family's control. It was in this atmosphere of pressure and necessity that a once unthinkable decision began to take shape. In 1930, Edith Vanderbilt opened Biltmore House to the public for the first time. The act was pragmatic, almost reluctant, and heavy with symbolic consequence. What had been designed as an intensely private refuge, an American shadow modeled on European aristocratic ideals, was transformed into a destination. Admission tickets replaced invitations. Guided tours replaced personal hospitality. The rooms remained unchanged, but their meaning shifted profoundly. Grandeur was no longer lived, it was displayed. The opening of the house to visitors represented a rupture in the estate's identity. Privacy, once absolute, dissolved into circulation patterns and viewing hours. The library, assembled for personal contemplation, became an exhibit. The banquet hall, built for intimate gatherings of select guests, echoed with the footsteps of strangers. This transition preserved the physical structure, but it exacted an emotional toll that cannot be measured in ledgers. Biltmore survived by surrendering the very exclusivity that had justified its creation. Financially, tourism provided relief but not salvation. Admission fees helped offset operational costs, yet they could not fully compensate for decades of accumulated expense and shrinking capital. The estate still required restoration, staffing, and modernization. Plumbing aged. Electrical systems demanded upgrades. The limestone exterior weathered relentlessly. Each year deferred maintenance risked greater damage later, creating a cycle in which survival depended on constant reinvestment. Biltmore did not escape collapse, it negotiated with it. Within the broader Vanderbilt lineage, this period marked a clear divergence between myth and reality. The family name still carried cultural weight, yet the vast fortunes that once defined it had fragmented. Taxes, philanthropy, and generational division had reduced what seemed limitless into something finite and fragile. Biltmore, the largest and most visible symbol of that wealth, bore the brunt of this transformation. It stood as evidence not only of what the family had achieved, but of how quickly such achievements could become liabilities when economic conditions shifted. The irony was stark. The estate had been built to project stability, permanence, and immunity from the volatility of markets. Yet its survival now depended directly on public interest, discretionary spending, and the fragile mechanisms of a tourism economy. Biltmore had entered the marketplace not as a competitor, but as an artifact, its value rooted in nostalgia for an era already judged excessive. Visitors arrived not to admire a living dynasty, but to witness the remains of one. As the decade progressed, the estate's role continued to evolve. Portions of the surrounding land were repurposed, further reducing the original scale of Vanderbilt's vision. Conservation efforts persisted, but increasingly as heritage management rather than pioneering experiment. The estate's narrative shifted from future-oriented ambition to curated memory. Biltmore was no longer trying to define what American wealth could become, it was explaining what it had once been. Yet survival, even under these altered terms, came at a cost that extended beyond finances. Each compromise, every land sale, every public tour, every adaptation to economic reality, eroded the coherence of the original dream. The estate endured, but as something fundamentally different from what its creator had imagined. What remained intact was the structure itself, magnificent and immovable, standing as a silent witness to the transformation of wealth from power into obligation. By the end of the Depression, Biltmore had weathered one of the most severe economic storms in modern history, but it emerged altered, cautious, and permanently exposed. The house still dominated the landscape, but its dominance no longer implied security. It implied persistence. And persistence, in the context of inherited grandeur, is often the most exhausting form of survival. The Vanderbilt family had preserved the monument, but the price of that preservation would continue to echo long after the crisis that made it necessary had passed. To be continued. As the Great Depression receded into memory, it left behind a quieter, but more enduring transformation. Biltmore had survived economic collapse, not by resisting change, but by redefining its purpose. The estate entered the mid-20th century no longer as a private seat of dynastic confidence, but as a carefully managed institution whose survival depended on adaptation. This shift was subtle, almost invisible to casual visitors, yet it marked the most decisive turning point in the estate's history. The Vanderbilt family no longer asked how Biltmore could express their identity. Instead, they asked how it could justify its continued existence. The onset of the Second World War intensified this transition. Once again, global forces pressed inward on the estate, reshaping its function without altering its form. During the war years, Biltmore House became a place of quiet service rather than spectacle. Portions of its vast interior were used to safeguard valuable artworks from Washington, D.C., including collections evacuated from the National Gallery of Art. In a profound historical irony, a mansion built as a private refuge for wealth now protected public cultural treasures from destruction. Its thick walls and remote location, once symbols of aristocratic withdrawal, became assets of national importance. This wartime role reinforced a growing truth. Biltmore's greatest strength lay not in luxury, but in scale and durability. The house had been overbuilt by 19th-century standards, and that excess now allowed it to endure pressures its creator could never have anticipated. Yet endurance did not equate to relief. The costs of maintenance continued unabated. Deferred repairs accumulated quietly, turning the estate into a perpetual restoration project. Each roof tile, stone joint, and mechanical system demanded attention, and each intervention required money that could not be recovered through sentiment alone. Within the Vanderbilt family, stewardship replaced ownership as the defining relationship to the estate. Decisions were no longer framed by personal taste, but by long-term viability. Rooms were closed seasonally to reduce wear. Staffing levels were adjusted with careful calculation. Public access was expanded and refined, transforming Biltmore into a model of the emerging American historic house museum. Visitors encountered the estate as a preserved world, meticulously curated to evoke continuity, even as that continuity was maintained through constant compromise. The post-war economic boom that revitalized much of America offered only limited relief. While prosperity returned to cities and industries, large private estates faced a different reality. Rising labor costs, expanding regulations, and modern expectations placed additional burdens on properties designed for a vanished social order. Biltmore's survival depended on a delicate balance between authenticity and practicality. Too much modernization risked erasing its historical integrity, too little risked physical decline. Every choice carried consequences that echoed across decades. By the middle of the century, Biltmore had effectively ceased to be a family home in the traditional sense. It remained associated with the Vanderbilt name, yet its daily life was defined by administrators, conservators, and visitors rather than descendants. This transition was not abrupt, nor was it publicly dramatized. It unfolded gradually, as the logic of inheritance gave way to the logic of preservation. The estate became a bridge between eras, connecting the Gilded Age's unchecked ambition with a modern sensibility that valued history as an asset to be managed rather than a power to be exercised. What made this transformation especially poignant was its inevitability. Biltmore had been built on a scale that assumed permanence without renewal. It presupposed that wealth, once amassed, would sustain itself indefinitely. The 20th century proved otherwise. Wars, taxes, and social change dismantled the foundations of that assumption. The estate endured not because the original model succeeded, but because it was replaced with one grounded in public engagement and historical relevance. In this sense, Biltmore's survival story mirrors the broader fate of America's great private estates. Few remained intact without becoming something else: museums, institutions, or commercial enterprises rooted in nostalgia. The Vanderbilt legacy, once defined by accumulation and display, was gradually reframed as custodianship. The family preserved the house not as a living assertion of dominance, but as a responsibility inherited alongside its burdens. As the century advanced, the estate stood increasingly as a lesson rather than a triumph. It demonstrated what immense wealth could build and what it could not protect against. Time reshaped Biltmore's meaning without diminishing its physical presence. The towers still rose above the landscape, unchanged in silhouette, yet their significance had shifted from power to memory. The house no longer promised permanence, it embodied endurance. And endurance, as the Vanderbilt family had learned across generations, comes at a cost that never truly disappears. Biltmore survived by transforming itself into history, but in doing so, it bound every future decision to the weight of the past. The estate had escaped ruin, but it had not escaped consequence. That reckoning, subtle and ongoing, would define its modern identity and the final measure of the price paid by the dynasty that built it. To be continued. By the late 20th century, Biltmore had crossed an invisible boundary. It was no longer merely surviving history, it was learning to operate within it. The estate's continued existence depended on a careful recalibration of purpose, one that acknowledged public appetite for heritage, while confronting the uncompromising arithmetic of preservation. What emerged was a model, neither purely private nor fully public, a hybrid form shaped by necessity. Biltmore would endure, not as a frozen relic of aristocratic life, but as a living enterprise whose product was memory itself. This transformation unfolded gradually, guided by a recognition that sentiment alone could not maintain stone, timber, and land at such scale. Expanded tourism became central. Seasonal programming, exhibitions, and curated narratives reframed the house as an immersive historical experience, rather than a dormant monument. Visitors were invited not only to observe rooms, but to inhabit a story, one carefully structured to convey continuity, elegance, and resilience. The estate's past was edited with restraint, emphasizing craftsmanship and vision, while softening the harsher truths of cost and consequence. Preservation required revenue, revenue required appeal. Agriculture, long a foundational element of the original design, was also reimagined. Vineyards and the establishment of a commercial winery reconnected the land to productivity in a contemporary form. These initiatives echoed George Vanderbilt's belief in self-sustaining systems, yet they operated under a modern logic of branding and scale. The landscape, once managed as an experiment in stewardship, now functioned as an economic asset, its beauty leveraged to support the house it surrounded. Conservation persisted, but it did so alongside commercialization, each reinforcing the other in a delicate balance. Throughout this period, the Vanderbilt name remained attached to the estate, but in a symbolic rather than directive sense. Descendants became stewards by legacy, rather than by daily presence. The house's identity shifted from familial expression to institutional continuity. Decisions were measured against long-term viability, visitor engagement, and preservation standards. Every adaptation, whether technological upgrades, accessibility improvements, or expanded events, required negotiation between authenticity and survival. The question was no longer how to honor the founder's intent exactly, but how to translate it into a world he could never have imagined. This recalibration carried a quiet irony. Biltmore achieved stability only after relinquishing the illusion of exclusivity that had justified its scale. Its endurance depended on openness, transparency, and a willingness to be interpreted by millions of strangers. The estate's power now lay in storytelling rather than command. It taught through example what the Gilded Age had produced, and what it had underestimated. Visitors encountered splendor, but also the implication that such splendor is never free. The house became an educator, its corridors narrating the limits of wealth as clearly as its ceilings displayed its heights. Yet even in this more sustainable form, the cost never vanished. Preservation is an ongoing negotiation with entropy. Stone erodes, systems age. Climate imposes new stresses on historic materials and landscapes. Each year brings decisions that trade immediacy for longevity, comfort for conservation. Biltmore's success did not eliminate these pressures. It organized them. The estate learned to live with its burden by making that burden productive, by turning maintenance into mission. In the broader cultural landscape, Biltmore's story acquired renewed relevance. As debates over inequality, inheritance, and historical memory intensified, the estate stood as a tangible case study. It neither celebrated nor condemned its origins outright. Instead, it persisted, inviting interpretation. Some saw it as a triumph of American ambition, others as a cautionary emblem of excess. Both readings coexisted within its walls, reinforcing the complexity of monuments built from private fortune. What ultimately endured was not the certainty George Vanderbilt sought, but a compromise shaped by time. Biltmore did not defeat impermanence, it negotiated with it. The Vanderbilt dynasty paid the price of that negotiation across generations financially, emotionally, and symbolically. The estate survived because it changed, and it changed because survival demanded it. In this way, Biltmore's legacy became less about dominance and more about adaptation, less about ownership and more about responsibility. As the modern era pressed forward, the house remained massive, beautiful, and exacting. It stood as proof that wealth can build wonders, but only humility and reinvention can keep them standing. The final measure of Biltmore's success was not its scale, but its willingness to evolve into something. Its creator never intended a public inheritance, sustained by collective curiosity, daring the quiet weight of a private dream that proved too heavy to carry alone. To be continued. Today, Biltmore Estate stands intact, admired, and meticulously maintained, yet its meaning has shifted far from the intentions of the man who built it. What once functioned as a private assertion of permanence has become a public space shaped by interpretation, memory, and economics. Visitors arrive not to witness living power, but to contemplate its residue. The house survives precisely because it no longer pretends to dominate the present. For the Vanderbilt family, Biltmore's endurance is both achievement and reckoning. The estate outlived the conditions that made its construction possible, and in doing so, exposed a central truth of the Gilded Age: extreme wealth can create monuments, but it cannot guarantee continuity. Each generation inherited not freedom, but obligation. The price of grandeur was paid slowly, through adaptation, concession, and the quiet surrender of privacy. Biltmore endures because it learned humility. It opened itself to the public, accepted reinterpretation, and allowed its story to be told not as triumph alone, but as caution. Its halls no longer declare certainty, they invite reflection. In this form, the estate has achieved a different kind of permanence, not as proof of dominance, but as evidence of limits. What remains is not the dream of invulnerability that George Washington Vanderbilt II once imagined, but something more durable and more human. A structure that admits change, carries consequence, and survives by remembering what it cost to be built. Biltmore stands because it stopped trying to escape time and chose instead to live within it. When the crowds thin and the lights dim, Biltmore Estate returns to its truest state: silence. The stone does not celebrate survival, nor does it mourn what was lost. It simply remains. In that stillness lies the final meaning of the estate, not as a symbol of wealth fulfilled, but as a record of ambition measured against time. For the Vanderbilt family, Biltmore became something no fortune can fully control, a legacy that demanded more than it returned. What was built to secure permanence instead revealed fragility, teaching that inheritance can weigh heavier than creation. The estate endured, but only by shedding the illusion that it could stand apart from history. Visitors leave with images of grandeur, yet the house offers a quieter lesson. Wealth can command labor, land, and artistry, but it cannot command the future. Only adaptation allows monuments to persist, and even then, persistence comes stripped of certainty. Biltmore survives not because it conquered time, but because it accepted it. And so the estate stands, vast and unmoving, no longer a declaration of power, but a witness. Its towers rise not to challenge impermanence, but to remind us that every monument, no matter how grand, eventually belongs to those who come after and to the stories they choose to tell. And, when the crowds thin and the lights dim, Biltmore Estate returns to its true estate silence. The stone does not celebrate survival, nor does it mourn what was lost. It simply remains. In that stillness lies the final meaning of the estate, not as a symbol of wealth fulfilled, but as a record of ambition measured against time. For the Vanderbilt family, Biltmore became something no fortune can fully control, a legacy that demanded more than it returned. What was built to secure permanence instead revealed fragility, teaching that inheritance can weigh heavier than creation. The estate endured, but only by shedding the illusion that it could stand apart from history. Visitors leave with images of grandeur, yet the house offers a quieter lesson. Wealth can command labor, land, and artistry, but it cannot command the future. Only adaptation allows monuments to persist, and even then, persistence comes stripped of certainty. Biltmore survives not because it conquered time, but because it accepted it. And so the estate stands, vast and unmoving, no longer a declaration of power, but a witness. Its towers rise not to challenge impermanence, but to remind us that every monument, no matter how grand, eventually belongs to those who come after and to the stories they choose to tell. End.